Robert Hilburn is a noted music writer and biographer who lives in Los Angeles, California. Born in 1939, Hilburn was about 30 years old when he assumed the role of chief pop music critic for the Los Angeles Times, a post he held between 1970 and 2005, and he has written extensively about artists such as Johnny Cash, Bob Dylan, John Lennon, Joni Mitchell, and Bruce Springsteen, among many, many others. In May of 2018, Simon & Schuster published Hilburn's book, Paul Simon, The Life, the first and only fully authorized biography of Simon, who granted Hilburn interviews with himself and many of the closest figures in his long career as an American songwriter, singer, and musician. Robert and I had a nice long chat about his own trajectory as a writer and critic, and why and how he chose to delve into the artistry of Paul Simon. With in-kind support from Pizza Trokadero, The Bookshelf, and Planet Bean Coffee in Guelph, Grandad's Donuts in Hamilton, and Planet of Sound locations in Ottawa and Toronto, and, of course, flexible monthly pledges by listeners like you at patreon.com/Creative Control. This is the 395th episode of Creative Control, featuring the great Robert Hilburn, with your host, me, Vish Khanna.
You don't have a wristband. You don't get to the door. And I said, wristband? I don't need a wristband. My axe is on the bandstand. My band is on the floor. I mean, it's just
Hi, Bob. How are you?
Hi, Vish. I'm fine, thanks.
It's nice to have you on the show. Where in the world are you as we're speaking, first of all?
Sitting in my office. I live in Los Angeles, and the same desk I wrote the Johnny Cash book, and the same book I used to write hundreds of reviews for the LA Times, and where I wrote this Paul Simon book. So it's a comfortable place for me.
It's an acclaimed desk, I might say. That's an important desk you're at, if I might say.
Dirty desk, but it's okay.
Well, first of all, congratulations on this new book, Paul Simon, The Life. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Now, I want to say something to you right away. First of all, I know from my own experience when I engage in the entire life history of an artist, at the end of it, I'm both elated, I'm exhausted. How are you feeling now that you're finished with your work on Paul Simon?
Oh, I feel good, because Vichy was a real challenge. I didn't realize how big a challenge it was when I started the book, but he's such a complex person, to try to capture. I wanted to capture two things. I wanted to tell his personal story, because that's what a biography is, but I also wanted to use Paul as a case study almost of what artistry is, how it comes about, how true artistry comes about, which very few songwriters really have, and then how you protect it against fame, wealth, divorce, drugs, changes in public taste, fear of failure, because I noticed over the years so many of the great songwriters drop out after 10 years of great work, or after 15 years of great work, or after 20. And almost everybody from the 60s and early 70s had pretty much lost their peak music. But Simon continues at this age to make music that I think can stand up comfortably by his early work.
Yeah, I was just today listening to Stranger again for the first time since it probably came out. Well, that's not exactly true. But anyway, it's remarkable. What a way to go out if he's indeed going out, Yeah,
it really is. I love that song, Stranger to Stranger. And it's really about some problems he had in his own marriage with Edie Brickell. And he wanted, they had to re-establish their relationships. That's the song. Imagine if you entered my life for the first time today, and then they were starting over.
Well, you mentioned that you wanted to try to delve into artistry specifically through the life and times of Paul Simon. What did you come away with there in terms of what distinguishes him from maybe other artists you've delved into in terms of their lives?
I'm really, really elated that the investigation, if you want to use that word, turned out so well, because it taught me so much about songwriting, what good songwriting is, and how unique Paul Simon is. There's a reason he's lasted all this time at the top level in pop music. I think if you took a list of the great songwriters ever in pop music, I'm talking about the Tin Pan Alley era and the rock era, Paul Simon would be high on that list. It's because of his two things: his determination of all the things I mentioned earlier, fame, money. It's music that matters most. He saw what happened to Elvis Presley, so he was always worried about fame. He tried to be a private person, not become part of the pop music tabloid. He was always focusing on the music, that dedication.
Yeah.
But what was interesting to me is I found he wasn't a natural-born songwriter. I mean, I thought he just came out of the cradle writing songs, but he didn't. He didn't even get interested in pop music till he was around 13. So he wasn't a kid who sat at the piano at age 3 and played a concerto, or he wasn't writing poetry in school books. He was just a kid having fun playing baseball. Then he finds pop music, and then he starts writing songs, copying what's on the radio, songs like his favorite artists, like Elvis Presley, like the Everly Brothers, like the doo-wop groups. And it was all kind of poor, mediocre music. And for 5 years he did that. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
That Simon, who we think of as just making one great album after the other, spent 5 years doing the most mediocre stuff you could imagine, nothing that was worth a damn. And then, because certain things happened in his life, and that's where the book really kicks in, he became the writer he is.
You just asserted, and you do so in the book as well, that he is really one of the all-time great songwriters, and for some people listening, that's a basic fact. That's inarguable. But is there a part of you that thinks he's given short shrift in the grand sort of tradition of great American songwriting?
Yes, absolutely, because he never had the persona that matched the music. Like Springsteen, David Bowie, Dylan, the Beatles, they all had this extra large persona. They were public figures. People followed them. Bruce Springsteen, you know what's going on in their life. Paul removed himself from all that. You didn't know what was going on in his life, so the only thing you knew about him was his music. You didn't have this image of an interesting character to go along with it. Plus, Paul kept changing. If Dylan and Springsteen and Neil Young and the Rolling Stones, and for all their greatness, they tend to work within a limited range. You know what Springsteen vaguely is going to do. You know what Young's vaguely going to do. You know what Dylan's vaguely going to do. But Paul Simon, that's the reason he left Simon and Garfunkel. He had so much ambition. He knew you have to keep changing. You have to keep growing to last. Otherwise, you'll end up like the Rolling Stones and tour for 30 years over music you did 40 years ago.
Well, there's something to be said about some of the artists you just mentioned, because when they had tried to embrace change, they were seen as trend hopping, trying to be fashionable, betraying their core. But Paul's core does seem to be ever evolving. He seems like a genuine, based on his music anyway. Like you say, his persona is a private one, but based on his music, he seems like a genuinely curious person.
Yes, and he absolutely is. He's as smart as hell. He's thoughtful. That's one of the frustrations sometimes of interviewing him. He takes a question seriously. A lot of musicians I talk to, they kind of have answers, kind of stock answers they go to over and over again. Some, not all, but I'm saying some of them.
Yeah.
And a lot of them. But Paul thinks about something, and he realized that, it begins with the way he writes a song. To my mind, first of all, he writes music and lyrics. The music is as important to him as the lyrics. That's not true of Dylan, for instance. Dylan, I've interviewed Bob about this. He takes old songs and kind of revamps them a little bit, old melodies. Bruce works within the same type of music and stuff. They don't create music every time. They're basically wordsmiths. But Paul realized that that music was important, and the way he writes, he doesn't come up with a theme like I would or you might and say, I want to write a song today about the world's problems, or I want to write a song today about how lonesome I am, or I want to write a song today about how I'm looking for a girlfriend. He comes up with the music first. He starts playing a piano or a guitar, and he picks at it until something in the music strikes him as, that's interesting, or that's warm, or that's evocative. Then the key thing is, he says, well, now how can I say in words what that music is making me feel? And then he takes it one line at a time. He'll come up with the first line, And usually in his songs, the first couple lines are true. He likes to start off with something that's real. Then he looks at that line and says, well, now what does that lead me to think? And that's the way he actually builds a song, sometimes over weeks or months.
Yeah.
But it's by discovery. He discovers his theme. Like Fellini, the great director, one time said, you can only make a movie from an original script. You can't take a book or a play and redo it because so much of your imagination is limited. And that's what Paul does. He takes everything. He starts off with the original script every time. It's always the idea of discovery. And one of the things I love in the book is he talks about some of the lyrics, and he tells about how one lyric came out of kind of his subconscious, and it took his breath away because it was so personal. But wait, I think that subconscious is part of a strong part of his process. He lets the subconscious help guide him.
Well, listen, I can't dispute anything you've said about Paul there, and I think you've put it rather eloquently, but as someone who's seen Bob Dylan upwards of 60 times, I must take exception to some of your ribbing there, because I don't think it's actually, I think Dylan's eras, his different modes are truly fascinating, and I'm enamored of them. I go see him 5-6, if he's coming through the area, or if I can get there, I'll go see him 5-6 times on a tour and always leave feeling like no show is the same. And I do think that in the book there is this jockeying between Paul and Dylan, about Paul Simon and Dylan, in terms of Bob is respected for his body of work. Paul, for some reason, is not as respected by like kind of cool people, if you will. And I mean, I remember I interviewed Greil Marcus a few years ago, and he took a special moment to criticize the work of Paul Simon, and I found it rather surprising. There seems to be, would you agree, is there some sort of weird, quiet, critical competition between Paul Simon and Bob Dylan?
Well, I think there was early, because, I mean, Paul admits that he would never have written The Sound of Silence without Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan got him started. He inspired him. But also he knew he couldn't beat Bob Dylan at that game. He couldn't beat Bob Dylan at writing those kind of folky, the Boxer kind of songs. So that the Boxer he said, this is my last Bob Dylan song. Wrote that, and it's great because Dylan actually recorded it. And I don't mean by any measure to demean Bob Dylan. He's great. I mean, he's the most important songwriter ever, because he started this whole rock and roll era. He brought, if I loved rock and roll, I loved Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, but I would have probably gotten over it by the time I was in my mid-20s, because it was teenage. But Bob Dylan brought thought to it. You could express ideas in it, and that's what made rock and roll live, and that's what influenced Paul Simon. He heard that, his Freewheelin' album, and that made him dig deeper in himself. And of course, he wanted Dylan's approval. And there were a couple scenes early that I think the first Simon and Garfunkel concert at a club in New York, Dylan was in the back of the room and started giggling in the middle of the show, and Paul thought he was trying, being disrespectful, but apparently Dylan had been drinking a bit with a friend, and they were laughing about something else, not about Simon and stuff, and they left because they didn't want to be embarrassing. So it was a little bit of, and also people kept comparing Simon to Dylan, and usually not favorable, because Dylan was first. They said, oh, he's kind of copying what Dylan did, and that's why Paul moved away from it so fast. By the time of, let's say, Mrs. Robinson, he was way away from Bob Dylan. There was no connection. He was writing music, not just the music. And then Bird Trouble Water, then Me and Julio. There's nothing at Bob Dylan largely after The Boxer. But people kept making that comparison often during the 70s, that somehow Paul is a second-rate Bob Dylan. And the point is, he's not a second-rate Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is an absolute A+, but Paul Simon is an absolute A+, too, over the body of their work. In terms of influence, no one's ever going to beat Dylan, as of now. But in terms of the body of work, if you put the body of work there, I think it's very close.
I can't dispute that on some level. Again, I do find it ironic that the scene you're describing at that first Simon and Garfunkel show, the way you depict it in the book, Dylan is actually sitting with Robert Shelton, his own journalist and biographer on some level, the one he was close to. So it's kind of funny. You're Paul's Bob, and Bob had his Bob, and it's kind of, there's something going on there.
And the one thing, I've interviewed Bob 10 times, maybe as much as anybody. And one of my greatest nights was in Amsterdam in early 2000s. I wanted to do a series on songwriting, the creative process for the LA Times. And Bob agreed to listen to me. And Bob's very different sometimes. Sometimes he's the warmest person. Sometimes he's just not interested. And, so you never know what you're going to get. So I flew to Amsterdam very nervous, wondering how much time he was going to give me and whether he was going to be really talking clearly as opposed to just kind of, wandering around. And so we get in, and it's about how do you write songs? That was the question. And he sits down and he starts talking for an hour and a half, and then there's a knock on the door. And those knocks on the door is a chance for the artist to end the interview, because a road manager comes in and says, "Oh, it's time now, Mr. Dylan, for your dinner or your next interview." And Bob put his hand up and said, "Give us another hour." So can you imagine how excited I was? Then the guy comes around in an hour, and Bob says, "It's okay, we're okay for the evening." And we talked 6 hours that night. And then at the end of the interview, get this, he says, "Are you going to be in town for the show tomorrow night?" And I said, "Sure." He says, "Well, why don't we get together again in case you have any more questions?" 9 hours. Wasn't that fabulous?
That is, I've been chasing in my lowly status, I've been chasing a Bob Dylan interview for many years, so you've made me incredibly jealous.
But the thing is, I love songwriting. I love creating a process. So in a sense, this book grew out of that. I said, how can I talk about songwriting from a person, who has been doing it for all these years, made all these changes, and that's the heart of the book to me, is exploring his songwriting process, Paul's songwriting process.
Absolutely. Now, I do want to delve into your work a little bit as it relates to Paul's ascent. My understanding is that you were a freelancer at the Los Angeles Times in 1969, but then you became the music editor in 1970. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was the first music critic at the Los Angeles Times because newspapers were slow in America to pick up on rock and roll. When the Beatles played the Hollywood Bowl in the 60s, the Times sent a teenager to review the show just to give his impressions, because they thought only teenagers were interested in rock and roll. But by 1970, things had changed enough to where I was hired full time.
Did that have something to do with the rise of sort of underground magazines? I include among them, Rolling Stone. I know Playboy was doing some cultural criticism at the time as well, but Rolling Stone seemed to mark a sea change in terms of rock criticism. Is that fair?
I think it is, but I think more than anything, I think Woodstock did it. This changed everything. This changed television. This changed advertising. When people saw what it was, 500 million people or whatever it was, upstate New York, that was what changed it. This is a major social force.
Right. So what I know you've clearly indicated that you are a lover of songwriters and great music. What actually prompted you to begin trying to write rock criticism?
Well, I loved rock and roll and movies since as a kid. I loved Elvis and then the Beatles and Dylan and so forth. And I was a newspaper writer. I was a reporter in a newspaper, and you would get calls sometimes at 3 a.m. to go out and cover a shooting or a flood or something. And I said, "Geez, I don't want to live my life waking up every morning and covering something I often even don't care about." Yeah. So what did I find to write about that I really wouldn't mind working 24 hours a day? And so the two things were music and movies. And I thought I didn't know enough about the history of film to be a movie critic, but I really didn't think I knew rock and roll. I knew it from the beginning. I mean, I was a fan of Elvis Presley before Heartbreak Hotel. I heard his early Sun records. And so I was very confident I could write about music, and I thought that would be a wonderful way to spend my time.
I've chosen the same path, and I agree with you. But I want to ask you about, because in 2013 you released this, this acclaimed biography about Johnny Cash was published, and Johnny Cash means the world to me. I know he means the world to lots of people, but just from an early age I was really struck by him, and the first concert I ever saw at Massey Hall in Toronto was the Johnny Cash and his family in 1996. So that resonated. Wow. He means the world to me. And you got to hang out with him a little bit. Like, you covered the Folsom Prison shows.
Yeah. Back at the time, I was trying to convince the Los Angeles Times to hire me as a pop critic. They said, "Well, do a couple stories. Let's see what you can do." And so I said, okay, I looked around at what's going on, and someone told me Johnny Cash was going to do a concert at Folsom Prison. I said, wow, what better thing is that? The guy who wrote Folsom Prison Blues doing a concert singing the song to prisoners at Folsom Prison. And the funny thing about it was the concert was not publicized or anything. Columbia Records had tried to do a prison concert earlier with Cash, but he was in such a bad state drug-wise that he didn't show up for the concert. So they were afraid he wouldn't show up again, so they didn't invite anybody to the concert. I got invited because a disc jockey who had read some of my stories in the paper thought I might be interested, and I went along with him, and he introduced me to Cash. And so I was so lucky to be at that moment, and then it was so amazing. Isn't it amazing? 40, 50 years later, you go back and write a book about that same person.
It is amazing. Did you get to know him a little bit beyond that that gathering? Did you become friendly with him?
I did. I did a long piece for Rolling Stone, a Q&A in the early 70s with Cash, and I would see him once in a while when he would come to town. I spent time, I visited him at his house in Nashville. He was a very nice, warm guy, and he was grateful for, I'd kind of helped him a lot in the beginning, and so I would write a story about him every, with 5 or 10 years or something. So we had a good relationship. It wasn't like you're calling each other on the phone or anything like that, but when you come to town, we might have dinner or do a story or something like that.
So when did you first start covering Paul Simon or Simon and Garfunkel? Did you have a memory of your first piece that covered either of those entities? Yeah,
I did the Bridge Over Troubled Water tour, their last tour in the Long Beach Arena in 1969, just a short review of it. And then I reviewed Paul's first album. The first time I met him or met Simon and Garfunkel was on his solo tour, which was 72 or 73, and I sat down for a couple hours with him at a hotel in Los Angeles, and he was so interesting because he's so thoughtful and so smart. He was what probably is articulate as anybody I've ever interviewed.
Well, he's also very competitive. I mean, we talked about Dylan earlier, and you mentioned, and you chronicle it in his book, in your book rather, that huge baseball fan. He has this competitive spirit about him, doesn't he?
Oh, he sure does. And sometimes, he uses one of the things that's kind of interesting. He uses a word so precisely. I'll say something, and he'll say, "I'm not competitive. I'm just, I'm just devoted or something." He is competitive, certainly. He was competitive as a young player in baseball. He was only 5'1" or 5'2", and he was playing on his high school team. He was an all-star. He stole home plate, went to third base. He stole home plate one time, which is very hard to do. Everything he did. And one of the great things he did early in our meetings, he gave me a list of some people he thought I ought to talk to who could help explain him. And remember, he's never talking to a biographer before. I was really excited about that. He agreed to talk to me a lot. We ended up talking 100 hours, and he told me about these other people to talk to too. And one of them was his closest childhood friend, Bobby Schuster. And Bobby was just great. I emailed him maybe 100 times during writing the book with a question about this and a question about that. And he talked about the nature of Paul, this competitiveness. The same kid in baseball who would do anything to beat you was the same way in the recording studio.
Yeah, I believe you end the book with a quote from Bobby Schuster. Is that right?
Bobby was great.
Yeah, a very significant figure. So how do you go from, covering Paul Simon throughout the early days of his career to getting to the point where he gives you access to his story that he's never given anyone? Can you talk about how you got involved in this project?
Yeah, well, see, again, I didn't write about Paul as much as I did, let's say, Springsteen or
Johnny Cash. Yeah,
because there was no relationship. The only time we would see each other, he wasn't that kind of person where he would kind of always be available for a story. Springsteen, whenever he did an album, or go on the road, he would talk. You could go on the road with him and spend time with him and stuff. You got to know that person. With Paul, it was only he was only going to talk about the album when it came out. So I talked to him again about, I guess the Still Crazy album. But I didn't have this kind of continuing relationship, except when he went to Graceland, I asked his publicist about going with him, and so I was the only American journalist who went with him to Zimbabwe when he did that first Graceland show. Mm-hmm. So, but anyway, so when I get through with the Johnny Cash book, I start thinking, well, who can I write about next? And I went back to that Dylan interview about the creative process, and I there was a very small list. We can talk about that sometime, about how do you choose a subject.
Sure, of course, yeah.
Because that's a very important thing. That's your most important step. Who do you choose? You want to choose somebody, to my mind, who's significant, who you're really interested in, and who's going to be remembered 50 years from now. And that eliminates 99% of people who make pop records today.
I have to concur, yeah.
No offense to them, but they're not at that level. You have your John Lennon, you have your Springsteen, Dylan, Paul Simon, Joni Mitchell. There's very few people, I think, that are worth spending 2 or 3 years writing about. So anyway, so I was thinking about Paul, but someone else was already writing a book about Paul. Somebody else had already announced that he was writing a book about Paul. And so I said, well, that's out. And then I spent another 4 or 5 months trying to think of who to write about, and I kept coming back to Paul, that songwriting. How does he write those songs? What's behind The Boxer? What's behind Questions for the Angels, which is a song I love, which was in his So Beautiful, So What album? Yeah. And so I called his manager, who also works with Dylan, interestingly, and I said, I understand someone's doing a book about Paul. Are you cooperating with them? They said, no, we're not. We have nothing to do with that book. We don't want to. We hope it never even comes out. And I said, well, if I did a book on Paul, would you think about it? Would you consider it? That him talking to, that he would be agreeable to talk and give me access and so forth. And I said, let me send you the book on Johnny Cash. And so I sent that. And so I'm not sure what combination, if it's just because Paul knew me from the past and felt I was an honest writer and stuff, or if he loved the Cash book or whatever it was. I got together with him in L.A. and we started talking about the book. And one thing was, he wondered how much time it would take. Because, again, that music, he doesn't want to take a time. He wants to work on his music. Mm-hmm. And I said, try to meet for 5 hours a day, 1 day a month for a year. That'd be 60 hours. And he kind of said, okay, I can do that. And it turned out it was much different. We met for a much longer period of time, in a longer period of, a couple of years. But so that was it. The idea that I said, I want to do a book about your artistry. I think it's important, and I think he also felt that by doing the book, he could end a lot of the other books that would be written about him otherwise. Books that are often based largely on what's been written before or who they can get to talk to him and so forth. But no one was ever going to get to Bobby Susser. No one was ever going to get to Paul Simon. No one was ever going to get to Paul Simon unless there was a certain degree of cooperation. But the important thing is, and we agreed from the start, that it would be my editorial control. I would be the one who finally said, this is what goes in the book and this is what doesn't go in the book. I would talk to him about certain issues, but it was always my final decision. And he never violated that. I kept worrying, because I'd heard about Neil Young had done a book with somebody, and halfway through he didn't like it and told the guy he didn't want the book done anymore and blah, blah, blah. So I was always worried about that, because it's delicate when someone comes around asking personal questions about your life, especially a person who's as private as Paul.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a whole entanglement here that I want to get to, because as music fans, we develop a certain intimacy with an artist and their work, and then if we become music journalists or critics, that intimacy kind of elevates. You can conceivably get to know someone by being in touch with them a little bit. You interview them, and then I can only imagine that all of those lines blur when you're an authorized biographer. Were you concerned about coming across as objective as possible in writing this book about Paul's life?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just made it clear. Again, we had the understanding at the beginning. It was my book, and but I wanted to make sure, I wanted to be as objective as possible. There was a time it came up, early on I contacted Art Garfunkel about, interviewing him. And he said, he was reluctant. And I said, why is that? Because you have such a big part in Paul's life. And he says, well, if you were writing about Simon and Garfunkel, I would talk to you, but I don't want to talk to you for a Paul Simon book. And I they were very apart at this time, and I kind of assumed that he meant he didn't want to do anything that helped Paul. And I said, look, this isn't Paul's book. It's my book, and I'll treat you with the same respect I treat Paul. I'll quote you honestly and so forth. And he said, well, let me think about it. Then he said his publisher, he was writing a memoir, didn't want him to do it because he didn't want him to give me some of his best lines. And I said, Art, your book's coming out first. He said, oh, okay. And then, so for a couple of years, I kept going after it. And finally, he wrote me a letter saying, I don't want to do an interview. And that was the end of that. But, I wanted to make clear in the book, and when I turned it before I turned it into the publisher, I had one of my best friends, a former editor of the Los Angeles Times, read it. And I said, I want you to do two things. I want to make sure it's an objective book. It doesn't look like it's something that Paul, that wrote a love letter to Paul. And secondly, I don't want to look like I'm beating up on Art Garfunkel, because there's negative things about Garfunkel in the book. And so he looked at both, he read both things and assured me that it looked to him as an objective book, and it didn't look like I was going out of my way to, pick on Garfunkel.
Well, in the book, Art Garfunkel kind of reminded me of the shark in the film Jaws.
Really?
He kind of comes and goes. Like you're kind of aware that Art Garfunkel is there in Paul Simon's life, was a huge force in Paul Simon's life, but at some point, Paul has to jettison him because of various... I don't want to give too much away. I think the dynamic is well represented in the book, but separate from the book, Bob, what is your perception of the Simon and Garfunkel dynamic? It's been very rocky. It seems to be, now that Paul has sort of indicated he's wrapping up his career, I don't sense that there's going to be much of a coming together again, because there have been so many, re-engagements of Simon and Garfunkel. What is your perception of their dynamic?
You mean right now?
Sure.
Yes, it's the furthest apart it's ever been. I don't think there's any communication. And at one time it was a wonderful relationship. They were great pals, as teenagers, and they had a great time on the Old Friends tour. That wasn't fake. They weren't faking it up there. That was a great tour for them. But in between all of that were all kinds of problems, which really dates back to, I think, the basic relationship of music. Again, Art has that beautiful voice, but Paul writes all the songs. And ultimately, he wanted more out of music than just writing folk songs and singing with Art Garfunkel, because there's a certain thing that he couldn't do with Garfunkel. So that's why I think he left him. He left him because he wanted more as an artist. And he could not have done Me and Julio or the whole Graceland album. That was, be ludicrous trying to have that as a Simon and Garfunkel album. So he needed that to grow. And Quincy Jones, who I interviewed for the book, because I wanted to talk about artistry with Quincy, and he said that's when he knew Paul was an artist, when he walked away from Simon and Garfunkel when it was the biggest group in the world.
Well, speaking of Quincy Jones, I know Quincy Jones encouraged Paul Simon when he started to explore the music that eventually emerged on Graceland and Rhythm of the Saints. It is a very controversial period in Paul Simon's life. In this day and age, we talk a lot about cultural appropriation and what's right and what's wrong. Was Paul particularly skittish about how you were going to deal with that?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think he's pretty confident in his decision. And he thinks, I think the things that Paul was probably most nervous about is not so much what I would say about the music or what somebody cared about him or what they thought about him, because he said once in a while, you ought to talk to so-and-so. He's not going to like me, but you ought to talk to him. I think he didn't want his personal life. He didn't want the personal life to be invaded as much. He didn't want something that would, probably hurt Edie. But there's nothing I came across necessarily would do that, so it wasn't, I didn't have to hide something. But I think that's what he was always concerned about, how it might affect his family.
Well, you spoke to Carrie Fisher, I understand, right?
That was great. She was fabulous. She lives just like 2 miles from me. And I had never met her or anything, of course, and she didn't know who I was, but it was just great. I spent like 4 hours with her, and she was so funny and so, open and revealing. I just loved spending time with her.
But you did not speak with Edie Brickell, is that right?
No, that's right, because again, that's the family issue. I didn't talk to Paul's kids because when he and Edie got married, Edie is more private than Paul, apparently. You know, I've said, when am I going to talk to Edie, Paul? She said, I don't think she's going to talk to you. And I thought, I was disappointed at first. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, because when they got married, he'd seen what fame is, the destructiveness of fame. And public knowing about you as a private person. He saw so many people get destroyed by that over the years, and their families torn apart. He and Edie agreed, look, we're never going to talk to the press about our family. We're never going to take pictures for People magazine of the family at home to help promote an album. We're going to move to Connecticut to get away from the big city, and so people won't, the kids can have a normal life in the country. That was their goal, and so we're never going to talk to people, and so they continue that during the book. Nothing's going to break up that. That's more important to him than anything now, is that relationship.
Well, one of the things that really focuses your interest in songwriting is something I've seen I've read a lot of rock biographies. I've seen some people do this, but you make a real point of publishing whole lyrics, like the entire a song's entire lyrics. What prompted that decision? Sometimes there's fragments and whatnot, but there's various points where you're talking about a song and you just publish the whole song.
Because I love lyrics. I love to hear lyrics, and I love to be reminded of them as a reader. I think it's so great if you're talking about American tune, and that you can think about it yourself, and you can try to remember parts of it. You might go listen to it on the record player, but if you can see it and read it, and I just think it's evocative to me. It's nice, it's sweet, and but it's so funny. When I did the Johnny Cash book, I had a lot of his lyrics in the book, and there's some thing on the internet where people comment about books. It's not like a professional book critic. It's just people give their viewings, and someone says, "Why did he have to pad the book out with all these lyrics?" The Johnny Cash book. The first review or first comment I saw of that same internet thing about the Simon book was, I don't think he needed all those lyrics in the book. But I I just personally love them. I think I think they add a warmth and a kind of they kind of help remind you of what's so great about it, why you're reading this book in the first place.
Absolutely. It made me want to revisit the records, and I did. So I thank you for that. Well, finally, there's something of a scoop towards the end of this book, and maybe it's not really a scoop anymore, because on some level we all know that Paul's current tour is purported to be his last, and you have this very lovely passage about him going to Hawaii and coming back and realizing for a vacation and coming back and realizing he's really said all he wants to say. Do you think that's true? Do you think he's sort of finished as a artistic force publicly?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Tom Friedman, who's one of his best friends, can't imagine him not writing another song. And that's probably true. At some point, he's going to want to write another song. But does he want to go to the grind of making an album, which takes a year and a half, then going on tour? I think, remember, for years, from the time he's 16 to the time of Graceland, he's sacrificed so much for music. Personal relationships, lots of stuff, because he was there working all the time on music. If he wasn't on the road, he'd be writing songs, he'd be recording songs. He's not a guy who just goes in and records them in 1 or 2 days. It takes him months to do an album, because he gets with musicians, their intricate arrangements. It's just he goes so far beyond most record makers in terms of the end product. That's why it's always so good. There's not a bad Paul Simon album. There might be one that's a B- or a B, but they're mostly A's.
It's true. I agree with you there. Are you...
Whereas you find other people, even our beloved Bob Dylan, and he's made some C- albums or D albums.
Sure.
And I don't mean to pick on Bob, because I love Bob, but take Springsteen. Springsteen has not made every album great. David Bowie hasn't made every album great. Joni Mitchell hasn't made, but Simon, every album is pretty damn great. So all that takes, it's a lot of pressure, it's a lot of time, it's a lot you're sacrificing, a lot you're losing. And then after Graceland, it gave him a certain confidence, because he had lost everything before Graceland. The One Trick Pony was a failure, the movie. The Hearts and Bones album was a commercial failure. Carrie Fisher divorces him, and then he read in Billboard magazine, which I mentioned in the book, which is a trade publication, they had a year-end edition which said, next year we're going to look for new voices. People want new voices. We're not going to play people like Paul Simon anymore. So he's sitting there at the depth of his despair. People don't even want to hear him anymore. So he goes off to, he says, well, I'm going to do something that I want to do and that's exciting. No one else would have ever gone to South Africa and made an album like that, because foreign music doesn't sell in America. You know, artists keep away from it for a reason. But Paul goes down there, even though people are saying, oh, you shouldn't go down there and record with South African musicians, even if they want to record with you. So he goes through all of that stuff, makes that brilliant album, which I think maybe is his masterpiece, and he realizes that he'll always have his music. You know, the music is there. That's his bridge over troubled water. And he became a warmer person after that. He began gradually seeking out other things he wanted to do in his life. And then by this time, 75 years old, 76 years old, he says, you know, I want to. He found a balance in his life. He wanted to explore the other side, the balance, more than maybe the music for a while. And we'll see how long that lasts. You know, maybe he'll just make an occasional record. Maybe he'll write another Broadway show. There's other things he can do, but he didn't want to get into the grind, if you will, of making another album, making another tour that all takes like 3.5 years or so. Maybe he could use that. He says, let me see what else I can do with that 3.5 years.
Yeah, I can see that too. I think you're on point there. This book is clearly a way of kind of affirming Paul Simon's legacy. That's my read on it. That's my read from this conversation. If there's any one particular thing that you'd like people to take away from this book, what would that be? Well,
you know, I think one thing is nice. That Paul, I think he is one of the all-time great, maybe one of the top 10 songwriters ever in America. So I think and I think he is underappreciated because of the lack of personal persona, and people just didn't. He was a stranger to a lot of people. They just don't think of Paul Simon right away when they think of songs. They think of Bob Dylan because they have this image of this guy Bob Dylan, and they have an image of Bruce Springsteen, but there's no image of Paul Simon. Paul Simon's a mystery to people in many ways. So I would hope the book would point out how great he is, and secondly, what a struggle it is, and be an inspiration to people about how, if you really want to be good at something, you have to really commit yourself to it. You can't just go in and copy what somebody else is doing or taking an easy way out. That all the songwriting he did came from hard work. You know, he's a talented guy, but also he had to learn how to approach that talent and to protect it. And that's the heart of the book to me, is what great songwriters do to continue their work over the years. So I'd love the two part. It's like two trains on two tracks. One part of the book is his personal life, and one part is the creative process. And I try to keep a balance of those, so that both the person who looks at the book for the personal life would be pleased, and the person who wanted to know more about the creative process would be illuminated.
Well, you mentioned hard work there, and you mentioned also earlier that you have, there's a short list of people you'd like to talk about or write about, and one of them was Johnny Cash, one of them was Paul Simon. What's next for you, Bob? Do you have a project lined up?
No, I'm not. I don't know. I've got 2 or 3 people in mind, but I don't want to mention it because I don't want to have somebody else say, "Oh, I'll rush and try to do a book on that first," or I want to talk to the people myself first and explain it rather than have them read about it or hear about it.
Well, the safe thing to say is you have plans of some kind.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so where can people go on the internet to learn more about you and this book, Paul Simon, The Life?
Okay, I have a website. Thanks for asking. It's Robert Hilburn, and that's Hilburn. It's like Hill we're burning with one L. So Robert Hilburn online.com. Is that what it goes? Yeah, I guess it is. RobertHilburnOnline.com.
Okay, and the book is out on Simon & Schuster, correct?
It comes out next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday. All right. Bob, this was a tremendous honor and a pleasure to have you on this show. I'm a fan of your work, and I thank you for writing this book, and I thank you for your time today, and best of luck in the future.
Thank you so much. Every question was good, and every minute was well worth the time. I enjoyed it so much.
Special thanks again to Robert Hilburn for being on this, the 395th episode of Creative Control, which is part of the Entertainment One podcast network and is available on all iOS and Android platforms and also on Spotify and YouTube and Audio Boom as well. If you can't find an episode that you're looking for some reason, or if you wish to learn more about me and sign up for my regularly scheduled newsletter, please visit my website, vishkhanna.com. That's VISHKHANNA.com. You can like Creative Control on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter at Vish Creative with a K, or follow me at Vishkhanna. You can also listen to a radio show version of Creative Control on Wednesdays at noon Eastern Standard Time around the world at CFRU.ca or on an actual radio at 93.3 FM if you're in or near Guelph. Also, please kindly visit patreon.com/Creative Control to make a flexible monthly donation to keep this podcast going. I couldn't do this without you. And the fact that you're listening and pledging and telling people about it, it means the world. So thanks again. Also want to thank all the people who support the show with in-kind contributions as well, and for sponsoring the show in various ways. Thanks to the crew at the Entertainment One podcast network and also CFRU 93.3 FM. I couldn't do this show without them. I'd like to thank my friend Jim Guthrie for letting me use the instrumental version of his amazing song, The Rest Is Yet to Come, to end this show each and every week. And like I said before, thanks to you for listening to this program. It means a lot. There's more episodes coming. I hope you'll listen to those too. And if you're behind, just take your time. There's no rush. Just catch up on episodes whenever you like. All right, I will talk to you very, very soon. Goodbye for now.